The War Council of the Zephyrin sovereignty convened with the kind of confidence that comes from 10,000 years of uncontested dominance. Their empire stretched across 47 star systems, their fleets had crushed a dozen civilizations, and their military doctrine had been refined through centuries of conquest into something approaching perfection. Fleet Commander Thrascon stood before the holographic display showing a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, and he could barely contain his anticipation. Earth, the humans called it. A planet rich in resources, perfectly positioned along emerging trade routes, and according to every intelligence report, completely defenseless. No orbital defense platforms. No particle beam networks. No antimatter mines seeding the approaches to their system. The humans had spread across their solar system with the enthusiasm of children playing in a garden, building habitats and research stations and trading posts, all utterly unprotected by any serious military infrastructure. The council members chittered their approval as Thrascon outlined the invasion plan. It would be simple, elegant, a textbook demonstration of overwhelming force applied with precision. 3 battle groups would be sufficient, possibly excessive for a species that seemed to have missed the fundamental lesson every spacefaring civilization learned, that the void between stars was not empty, but filled with predators waiting for weakness. Intelligence reports showed that Earth's military consisted primarily of atmospheric craft and ground vehicles, primitive kinetic weapons, and nuclear devices that were barely more sophisticated than controlled chemical reactions. They had nothing that could challenge even a single Zephyrin dreadnought, much less a full invasion fleet. The vote to proceed was unanimous, the council members already calculating the profits from Earth's mineral wealth and the prestige of adding another conquered species to the sovereignty's growing empire. What the intelligence reports hadn't mentioned, what the Zephyrin analysts had somehow missed in their thorough examination of human civilization, was the peculiar silence that fell over the galactic communication networks whenever Earth was discussed. The sovereignty's neighbors, species that had their own long histories and deep knowledge of galactic affairs, said nothing when news of the planned invasion spread through diplomatic channels. They didn't warn the Zephyrins. They didn't offer advice. They simply watched with the careful attention of survivors who had learned painful lessons and were curious to see if someone else was about to learn them too. The Ctheran Collective, whose borders touched human space, received the invasion announcement and immediately began reinforcing their defensive positions along their own frontier, but not the one facing Earth. The Dorvaxian Republic quietly suspended all trade missions to Zephyrin space and recalled their ambassadors for consultations. And the ancient Velkari, who rarely involved themselves in the affairs of younger species, made note of the date and settled in to observe. Thrascon's fleet departed Zephyrin Prime with full military honors, their ships gleaming in the light of twin suns as crowds gathered to witness the launch of what propagandists were already calling the Earth Pacification Campaign. 300 vessels strong, carrying enough firepower to sterilize a dozen planets, supported by troop carriers holding 200,000 soldiers and the logistical train necessary to occupy and exploit a conquered world. The journey to Sol system would take 6 weeks at maximum sustained velocity, and the fleet traveled in perfect formation, confident in their strength and secure in their purpose. They had done this before. They knew how conquest worked. A show of overwhelming force, the destruction of any orbital assets, a demonstration strike on a military target, and then negotiations with whoever was left in charge. Most species surrendered after the demonstration. The ones who didn't learned quickly that resistance only increased their casualties. The first indication that something was wrong came when the fleet reached the outer boundary of the Sol system. There should have been response from Earth by then. Panic, most likely. Desperate transmissions begging for mercy or attempting negotiation. Instead, there was silence, and then a single transmission on an open channel. A human woman's voice, speaking accented but clear Zephyrin, welcomed them to the Sol system and politely requested they state their intentions. The tone was cordial, almost bureaucratic, as if a massive invasion fleet was a minor administrative matter requiring proper documentation. Thrascon, confused but not yet concerned, responded with the standard invasion protocol announcement: surrender or face annihilation. The response came back within seconds. The woman thanked him for the clarification and informed him that his fleet's approach was being monitored and that Earth hoped this situation could be resolved peacefully. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added a single sentence that would haunt Thrazkan for the rest of his life: "Please be advised that 73 other species have attempted what you're attempting. We maintain diplomatic relations with most of them now." The fleet continued its approach, but the confidence that had characterized their departure had developed hairline fractures. 73 attempts? That couldn't be accurate. Earth had only been in space for barely 2 centuries. How could 73 species have tried and failed to conquer them in such a short time? The intelligence division worked frantically, cross-referencing databases, searching for any mention of military conflicts involving humans. They found scattered references, carefully worded diplomatic statements, and a curious pattern of species that had once been aggressive expanding their borders suddenly becoming much more conservative in their territorial ambitions after brief, rarely discussed encounters with human forces. One report, filed by a Ctheran observer and marked with the highest security classification, contained a single line: "Recommend extreme caution. Humans employ defensive doctrines outside conventional military theory." The report was dated 40 years earlier, and the Ctheran who had written it had subsequently retired from military service to become a monk. The Zephyrin fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter, and that's when they saw the first human vessel. It wasn't a warship, at least not in any configuration that made sense according to standard military design principles. The craft was small, perhaps a tenth the mass of a Zephyrin destroyer, with a hull configuration that seemed more suited to cargo transport than combat. It hung in space along their approach vector, making no attempt to flee or engage, simply broadcasting on all frequencies that the Zephyrin fleet was entering restricted space without authorization. Thrazkan ordered weapons locked on the vessel, more out of procedure than any sense of threat. One small ship against 300? It was almost insulting that Earth thought this constituted a defense. The firing command was prepared, and then the human ship did something that made every tactical officer in the fleet suddenly recalculate their assumptions. It split apart. Not from damage or malfunction, but deliberately, the hull separating into a dozen smaller craft that scattered in a pattern that seemed random until the fleet's combat AI identified it as an optimal targeting spread for point defense systems. But these weren't point defense weapons. The human craft launched salvos of missiles that moved with acceleration curves impossible for any conventional propulsion system, each warhead reading as containing yields in the low gigaton range. Not antimatter, the Zephyrin sensors reported with confusion, but some kind of exotic matter reaction that their databases couldn't classify. The fleet's defensive screens activated, particle beams tracking and destroying the incoming missiles, but the detonations at a safe distance still sent radiation spikes across multiple spectrums. The human craft reformed into their original configuration and retreated beyond Jupiter's orbit, broadcasting another polite message suggesting the Zephyrins might want to reconsider their approach. Thrazkan ordered the fleet to continue, but now there was uncertainty rippling through the command channels. That had been one ship, clearly a scout or picket vessel, and it had deployed weapons that, while not dangerous to the fleet's shields, were far more sophisticated than intelligence had suggested. The commander convened a hasty strategy session with his senior officers. The consensus was that Earth was attempting psychological warfare, showing just enough capability to create doubt but probably holding back nothing of real significance. After all, if they had serious defensive capabilities, why not deploy them in force? Why send single ships to harass rather than mounting a proper defense? It was posturing, the officers agreed. A desperate bluff from a species that knew they were outmatched. The invasion would proceed as planned. The asteroid belt was where everything changed. The Zephyrin fleet had detected the presence of human mining operations throughout the belt, thousands of automated facilities and dozens of manned stations extracting resources from the countless rocks that orbited between Mars and Jupiter. It was a target-rich environment, and Thrazkan ordered a demonstration strike on one of the larger stations to show Earth what awaited them if they continued this futile resistance. 3 destroyers broke formation and moved to execute the order, their weapons charging as they approached a station that showed no signs of evacuation or defensive preparations. The station simply sat there, lights on, mining equipment still operating as if the approach of warships was beneath its notice. The destroyers achieved optimal firing range, locked targeting solutions, and fired. The station disappeared. Not from the impact of Zephyrin weapons, but a fraction of a second before the weapons would have struck. It simply wasn't there anymore, and in its place was a spherical field of distorted space that bent the incoming weapons' fire into vectors that sent the energy beams corkscrewing off into deep space. The field collapsed, and the station reappeared exactly where it had been, completely undamaged. From a dozen other locations throughout the belt, similar fields blossomed into existence, and through each one came human ships. Not scouts this time, but warships that ranged from frigate to cruiser class, each one moving with acceleration that shouldn't have been possible for their mass. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, they formed a perimeter around the Zephyrin fleet, effectively surrounding 300 vessels with maybe 60 of their own, and broadcast yet another message. This time the voice was male, older, with an accent that suggested authority earned through experience rather than rank. He introduced himself as Admiral Chen, commanding officer of Seoul Defense Force, and he suggested very strongly that the Zephyrin fleet halt its advance and prepare for negotiations. Thraz Khan, faced with tactical displays showing his fleet surrounded by vessels employing technology that violated several accepted theories of physics, made what he thought was the only logical decision. He ordered his fleet to open fire on the nearest human warship, intending to punch through their perimeter and continue to Earth. It was the last order he would give as a free commander. The human ships responded not with weapons, but with something that the Zephyrin combat AI took almost 30 seconds to classify because it had never encountered anything like it before: weaponized gravity. The space around Thraz Khan's flagship suddenly increased in mass by a factor that made the ship's inertial dampeners scream in protest. Every member of the crew was slammed to the deck by force that felt like planetary gravity had been multiplied tenfold. Systems failed across the ship as components designed to operate in zero-G tried to cope with acceleration stress they were never built to handle. The effect lasted only 5 seconds, but when it released, the flagship was a crippled wreck, life support functioning but weapons offline, engines dead, communications reduced to short range only. Around the fleet, 24 other Zephyrin vessels had received the same treatment, chosen with precision to disrupt fleet cohesion without destroying command and control entirely. The remaining vessels hung in space, weapons armed but no one daring to fire, as the human ships maintained their perimeter with the casual competence of herders managing particularly stupid livestock. Admiral Chen's voice came over the fleet-wide channel again, and this time Thraz Khan heard something in his tone that he would later recognize as pity. The human explained that this was what they called a proportional response to hostile action in their territory. No one had been killed, no ships destroyed, just enough force applied to make the point that further aggression would be costly. He then asked, in that same tired voice, if Thraz Khan would like to hear about the other 72 attempts to invade Earth. The commander, sitting on the deck of his ruined bridge, managed to croak out an affirmative. What followed was a 2-hour lecture that would fundamentally reshape the sovereignty's understanding of both human capabilities and the nature of defensive warfare itself. Admiral Chen began with the Kravix incursion, the first serious attempt to conquer Earth just 60 years after humanity achieved faster-than-light travel. The Kravix had been confident, much like the Zephyrins, bringing a fleet of comparable size and assuming that technology gap and military experience would ensure easy victory. They had even published invasion plans in their press, so certain were they of success. Chen described how that engagement had ended with the entire Kravix fleet disabled and drifting in high orbit around Venus, their crews unharmed but trapped in dead ships until human rescue vessels could collect them. The Kravix ambassador, when finally allowed to meet with human negotiators, had asked the question that would be repeated by 72 other species over the following decades: how had humanity developed such devastating defensive capabilities with no apparent offensive fleet, no history of conquest, and no visible military-industrial complex capable of supporting such technology? The answer, Chen explained with something approaching amusement, was that humans approached warfare from a fundamentally different perspective than most galactic civilizations. While other species built militaries designed to project power and conquer territory, humanity had spent most of its history fighting itself. 10,000 years of nearly continuous warfare on a single planet had taught humans every possible variation of conflict, from individual combat to total war, from asymmetric resistance to massive industrial mobilization. By the time humanity reached the stars, the art of war had been refined to a degree that species with longer spacefaring histories but less combat experience couldn't match. But more than that, humanity had learned a crucial lesson from its bloodiest conflicts, that defensive warfare, warfare aimed at survival rather than conquest, could be waged with an intensity and innovation that made it more terrifying than any invasion. Chen walked Thrascon through the technical specifications of human defensive doctrine, not to gloat but with the careful precision of a teacher ensuring the lesson was understood. The gravity weapons that had disabled the flagship were based on manipulation of the Higgs field, technology humanity had developed not for military purposes but for construction projects in high-gravity environments. The missiles with impossible acceleration used microscopic amounts of antimatter for propulsion, a solution humans had devised because we lacked the exotic matter other species used for their drives. The instantaneous teleportation technology that had moved the mining station was actually quantum entanglement manipulation, originally developed to solve communication lag in the outer solar system. Humanity's entire military arsenal, Chen explained, consisted of civilian technologies that had been adapted for defensive purposes when other species kept trying to invade. The pattern repeated across every engagement. The Solvathi had attacked Earth with biological weapons, confident that their engineered plagues would decimate humanity before any fleet action became necessary. They had not accounted for a species that had been fighting microscopic enemies for its entire existence, that had developed medical technology out of desperate necessity long before reaching the stars. The plagues were neutralized within weeks, and the Solvathi found themselves facing retaliatory biological agents that were disturbingly effective. Not weapons designed to kill, Chen was careful to note, but pathogens engineered to cause temporary but debilitating illness that left the Solvathi fleet incapacitated until human medical teams could arrive with cures. The engagement ended with a biosciences exchange program that now had Solvathi researchers working alongside humans to combat diseases across both species. The Mordranth had attempted a siege strategy, positioning their fleet beyond human weapon range and bombarding Earth's infrastructure from a distance they assumed was safe. They learned, as Admiral Chen described with evident satisfaction, about humanity's approach to kinetic weapons. Humans had been throwing rocks at each other since before recorded history. We understood ballistics at an intuitive level that came from millions of years of evolution as hunters and tool users. The Mordranth fleet found itself under assault from asteroids that had been accelerated to relativistic speeds, their trajectories calculated with such precision that point defense systems couldn't track them until impact was inevitable. The bombardment lasted 3 hours before the Mordranth withdrew, their fleet reduced by half. The human terms for ceasefire included technology sharing on asteroid mining and a mutual defense pact that still stood 40 years later. Chen continued through the list, and with each story, Thrascon felt his understanding of the strategic situation shift. The Yalthari had tried infiltration and sabotage. The Kreks had attempted economic warfare. The Penthari launched a surprise attack on human colonies in the outer system. Each time, humanity had responded with capabilities no one knew existed, technologies adapted from civilian applications with a speed that suggested Earth maintained entire research programs dedicated to turning every scientific advance into a potential weapon. But more disturbing than the technology was the attitude Admiral Chen described. Humans didn't celebrate these victories. There were no monuments to military conquest, no parades for returning heroes who had defeated invaders. Instead, Earth mourned the necessity of violence and immediately sought reconciliation with former enemies. It was the Corvash incident that finally made Thrascon understand why none of the other species had warned the Zephyrins. The Corvash had been the most recent attempt before the Sovereignty's invasion, and they had been thorough. They studied human defensive patterns, identified weaknesses in coverage, and struck at a colony world that should have been vulnerable. The Corvash had not counted on humanity's reaction to an attack on civilians. Chen's voice went cold as he described what happened next. Human forces had appeared within hours, not the measured defensive response of previous engagements, but a fleet that moved with lethal purpose. The Corvash attacking force was annihilated in 40 minutes. Not disabled. Not captured. Completely destroyed with a level of violence that shocked the galactic community. In the aftermath, humanity had stood before the Galactic Assembly and stated in clear terms that attacks on military targets would be met with defensive response, but attacks on civilians would be met with overwhelming retaliation. Admiral Chen finished his recitation and gave Thrascon a choice. The Zephyrin fleet could withdraw peacefully, with disabled ships being towed to Mars orbit for repair before being escorted out of the Sol system. In exchange, the sovereignty would enter negotiations for a non-aggression pact and technology exchange. Or they could continue their invasion attempt, in which case humanity would demonstrate the offensive capabilities they had been carefully not using. The choice, Chen emphasized, was entirely up to the Zephyrins. But he strongly recommended the first option, because in 2 centuries of being invaded, humanity had never once shown its full military strength. Every engagement had been calibrated response, proportional force, defensive action designed to end conflicts quickly while preserving life on both sides. No one in the galaxy knew what humanity could actually do if they decided survival required total war, and Chen very much hoped it would stay that way. Thrascon sat in the silence of his disabled bridge, surrounded by crew members who were listening to every word being broadcast across the fleet channels, and made a decision that would alter the course of Zephyrin history. He accepted Chen's terms unconditionally. The response was not cowardice, though some in the sovereignty would later call it that. It was the recognition that Earth had just offered him and his entire fleet something that most invaders never received, mercy paired with education. The human forces could have destroyed the Zephyrin fleet within minutes of their arrival in the asteroid belt. Instead, they had spent hours teaching Thrascon exactly why invading Earth was suicide dressed up as military strategy. The commander gave the order for all vessels to stand down, power down weapons, and prepare for escort to Mars orbit. What happened next surprised Thrascon almost as much as the gravity weapons had. Human ships moved among the disabled Zephyrin vessels, and instead of boarding parties and occupation forces, they sent engineering teams. Repair crews swarmed over the damaged ships, working with efficiency that suggested they had done this many times before. Medical teams transported aboard vessels reporting casualties, treating Zephyrin wounded with the same care they would give their own people. Supply shuttles arrived carrying food, water, replacement components, and detailed repair manuals translated into Zephyrin script. Within 6 hours, every ship in the fleet had been stabilized, life support restored, and basic communications re-established. The human crews worked without speaking much, professional and courteous, but there was an underlying message in their efficiency: we could have killed you, but we're choosing to save you instead. The tow to Mars orbit took 3 days, and during that time Thrascon was given access to human information networks, specifically the historical archives relating to Earth's military engagements. He spent 72 hours reading accounts of the 73 invasion attempts, cross-referencing them with interviews from commanders who had survived their encounters with human forces. A pattern emerged that was as disturbing as it was consistent. Humanity didn't want to fight. Every engagement showed evidence of humans trying to avoid conflict up until the moment violence became inevitable, and then responding with overwhelming but precisely calibrated force. Casualties among invading forces were almost always minimal, with humans going to extraordinary lengths to preserve life even among those actively trying to kill them. The Drakvani account was particularly illuminating. Their commander, who had survived an attempted invasion 30 years earlier, described being given a tour of Earth's actual defensive capabilities after his surrender. He had been shown weapons that existed only in prototype form, technologies that violated thermodynamics and causality in ways that made his species' scientists weep with frustration. Antimatter bombs measured in megatons, not kilotons. Quantum disruption weapons that could cause atomic bonds to simply stop working. Nanotech swarms capable of disassembling ships at the molecular level. Artificial intelligence systems with reaction times measured in nanoseconds and tactical creativity that matched the best organic commanders. None of these weapons had ever been used in combat. They existed, the human liaison had explained, as absolute deterrence, as proof that if you pushed humanity far enough, they could push back hard enough to shatter civilizations. What struck Thrascon most deeply was the underlying psychology revealed in the human approach to defense. They didn't build weapons to conquer or intimidate. They built them because they lived in existential terror of being conquered themselves. Earth's history was a catalogue of civilizations that had fallen to invasion, peoples who had been enslaved or exterminated, cultures erased by stronger neighbors. Humanity had collective trauma from 10,000 years of knowing that someone could always show up with better weapons and take everything from you. That fear had been refined into a defensive doctrine that was essentially weaponized paranoia: assume that someone would always try to invade, prepare for threats beyond what seemed reasonable, and respond to aggression with such force that no one would ever want to try again. But paired with that paranoia was something equally powerful, a desperate desire to not become the thing they feared. Humans didn't want to be conquerors. They didn't want to be the species that showed up with overwhelming force and took what they wanted. So they built purely defensive capabilities, technologies that worked only in their own territory or in response to aggression. The gravity weapons had limited range. The relativistic kinetic strikes required months of preparation and only worked in defense of fixed positions. The quantum teleportation needed established anchor points. None of humanity's most devastating capabilities could be used offensively beyond their own system without massive logistical support that would take years to establish. Earth had built itself into a fortress that was essentially invulnerable within its own walls but couldn't effectively project power beyond them. It was a civilization-level commitment to defense over offense, survival over expansion. The fleet reached Mars orbit, and Thrascon was invited to the surface for formal negotiations. He descended through the thin atmosphere in a human shuttle, accompanied by his senior officers and a diplomatic contingent that had been hastily briefed on everything he had learned. The meeting took place in Olympus City, the largest settlement on Mars, in a conference room with windows overlooking the terraformed valleys where Earth's plants were slowly turning red soil green. Admiral Chen was there, along with representatives from Earth's government and military command. They offered tea, which Thrascon's biology couldn't process, and then spent 6 hours negotiating the terms of non-aggression. The treaty was surprisingly generous from the human perspective. No reparations for the invasion attempt. No territorial concessions. No requirements that the sovereignty reduce its military capabilities or alter its governing structure. The humans wanted only 3 things: a binding agreement that the sovereignty would never again attempt military action against human interests, establishment of formal diplomatic relations with embassy exchanges, and participation in what humans called the Mars Accords. This last item was new to Thrascon, and Chen explained it with obvious pride. Every species that had attempted to invade Earth and survived was offered membership in a mutual defense network. If any signatory was attacked by an external force, human defensive technology would be made available to help resist the invasion. In exchange, signatories agreed to help mediate disputes, share intelligence about potential threats, and most importantly, warn other species away from attempting to invade Earth. It was brilliant, Thrascon realized. Humanity had turned 73 attempted invasions into a defensive alliance network that spanned dozens of species. Former enemies had become partners in mutual survival, united by their shared experience of learning why attacking Earth was a catastrophically bad idea. The Mars Accords weren't just a treaty. They were a systematic effort to ensure that no species ever again had to learn the hard way what happened when you threatened humanity. It was defensive doctrine extended to the diplomatic realm, turning potential conflicts into cooperation before they escalated to violence. And it was working. The species who had signed the accords hadn't remained peaceful because of fear, but because they had been given something more valuable than conquest: security backed by the most sophisticated defensive technology in known space. Thras-Khan returned to Zephyrin Prime 6 weeks after departing, not as a conquering hero but as an ambassador bearing a treaty that would fundamentally reshape the sovereignty's place in the galaxy. The reception was mixed. Military hardliners called for his execution for cowardice in the face of a numerically inferior force. Pragmatists in the government noted that he had brought the entire fleet home intact, which was better than 73 other commanders had managed. The civilian population, fed a steady diet of propaganda about the upcoming conquest, struggled to understand how 300 warships had been defeated without a single human vessel being destroyed. The truth, when it finally came out, was almost harder to accept than military defeat. Humanity had been holding back for the entire engagement, using only enough force to disable and capture because killing was more expensive than teaching. The sovereignty's strategic analysts spent months reviewing every scrap of data from the invasion attempt, and their conclusions were unanimous and terrifying. Earth's defensive capabilities were at least 50 years ahead of anything the Zephyrins possessed, possibly more. The technologies humanity employed casually, almost apologetically, would require decades of research for the sovereignty to replicate. But more concerning than the technology gap was the doctrinal sophistication. Humans understood warfare at a level that came from practicing it constantly for their entire history. They had studied every form of conflict, every tactical scenario, every strategic possibility, and developed responses that were both creative and devastatingly effective. Fighting them in their own territory was suicide. Fighting them anywhere was inadvisable unless you were prepared to accept casualties that would horrify even the most aggressive military planners. The vote on ratifying the Mars Accords was contentious, but eventually passed by a narrow margin. The sovereignty would become the 74th signatory, joining a network that included species from every corner of explored space. The first embassy exchange happened 3 months later, with human diplomats arriving on Zephyrin Prime bearing gifts of technology and cultural artifacts. They were courteous, professional, and absolutely clear about the terms of their relationship with the sovereignty. Peace was vastly preferable to conflict, but if conflict became necessary, humanity would end it quickly and decisively. The message was delivered without threat or swagger, simply a statement of fact from people who had proven it 73 times already. What surprised the Zephyrins was how quickly the relationship evolved beyond simple non-aggression. Human scientists began collaborating with sovereignty researchers on projects that had nothing to do with military applications. Cultural exchanges brought human artists and musicians to Zephyrin worlds, while Zephyrin students applied for educational programs on Earth and Mars. Trade agreements were established that benefited both civilizations, with humans showing particular interest in Zephyrin expertise in atmospheric engineering. Within a year, the attempted invasion had faded from current affairs into history, just another entry in the long list of species who had learned why attacking Earth was a mistake. The relationship had normalized in a way that previous conflicts never had for the sovereignty, because humans genuinely bore no grudge once peace was established. Thras-Khan, stripped of his military rank but appointed as the sovereignty's first ambassador to Earth, spent his remaining years trying to understand humanity's fundamental paradox. They were capable of such devastating violence, possessed weapons that could sterilize worlds, and had demonstrated the will to use overwhelming force when threatened. Yet they chose peace at every opportunity, went to extraordinary lengths to preserve life even among their enemies, and seemed genuinely distressed when forced to defend themselves. He watched humans grieve over Zephyrin casualties from the invasion attempt, saw memorial services held for the 12 soldiers who had died in the initial gravity weapon strikes, and realized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or tactical doctrine. It was their capacity for empathy even toward those who had tried to kill them. The ambassador wrote a book in his final years, a detailed analysis of human defensive capabilities and the psychology that drove them. It became required reading at military academies across the sovereignty and beyond, passed between species through the Mars Accords network. The central thesis was simple: humanity was dangerous not despite their preference for peace, but because of it. They had spent 10,000 years killing each other and learning to regret it, developing weapons of incredible sophistication and then desperately seeking alternatives to using them. By the time they reached the stars, humans had become experts at both war and peace, capable of transitioning between the two states with shocking speed. They could be negotiating trade agreements one moment and deploying world-ending weapons the next, and they approached both with the same focused intensity. The galaxy slowly adjusted to the reality of what humanity represented. Not conquerors or victims, but something that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. A species that could fight with a ferocity born from millions of years of evolutionary pressure, but chose not to unless given no alternative. A civilization that built fortresses instead of fleets, that turned every scientific advance into a potential defensive application while refusing to develop offensive capabilities beyond their own borders. Earth remained defenseless in the sense that they maintained no invasion forces, no occupying armies, no infrastructure for projecting power across interstellar distances. But everyone now understood that defenseless was not the same as helpless, and that attacking the small blue world orbiting that unremarkable yellow star was the last mistake many species would ever make. The Mars Accords grew to include over 100 signatory species within 2 decades, creating a defensive network that paradoxically made the galaxy safer than it had been in millennia. Species who might have been enemies found common ground in their shared experience of learning humility from humanity. The attempted invasions continued occasionally, new species arriving in Sol system with plans of conquest, but they were increasingly rare as word spread through galactic civilization about what waited for invaders. The humans remained patient, explaining their capabilities to each new threat, offering peace until violence became inevitable, and then demonstrating why 73 previous attempts had failed. Each time, the invading species would retreat, wounded but alive, and begin the process of becoming the next Mars Accord signatory. Thrascon died peacefully on Earth, in a hospice overlooking the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by both Zephyrin and human friends. His last words, recorded for posterity, were a warning to any species that might still be considering an attack on humanity: they will give you every chance to choose peace. They will explain why fighting them is unwise. They will show mercy even when you have shown them none. But do not mistake any of this for weakness. Humanity has spent 10,000 years learning how to kill, and 200 years learning how to stop. The fact that they choose not to should terrify you more than any weapon they possess. Because the day they stop choosing peace is the day you learn what war truly means to a species that has perfected it. The message was broadcast across the galactic networks, translated into 1,000 languages, and became the informal motto of the Mars Accords. And in the decades that followed, as peace gradually spread across regions that had known only conflict, species came to understand what Thrascon had realized during those 3 days being towed to Mars orbit, that Earth's greatest defense had never been their weapons or their technology. It had been their absolute refusal to become the monsters they knew they could be. That restraint, that conscious choice to seek peace even when they possessed the power to wage war, was what made them truly dangerous. Because a species that knows how to destroy you and chooses not to has a moral authority that no amount of military force can challenge. And humanity wielded that authority with the same devastating effectiveness they brought to everything else, perfectly, precisely, and with just enough mercy to leave you grateful to be alive.